do I remember? I remember it. Not much. 1963 or 62. I just remember watching on TV and hearing stuff. That part of the Cold War?
Yeah, it was when the Soviet Unions were basically supporting and sending missiles to Cuba, which would target the U.S.
The Soviet Union was setting up missiles in Cuba that could easily, if they're fired, reach the United States, and the United States didn't want that. Even though the United States had missiles set up outside of Russia and lands all around Russia at the time, particularly in Turkey.
So what were your feelings about that or something?
Well, what actually got resolved, well, the U.S. said you can't do it, and the Russia said we will do it, and the U.S. says you can't do it, and they went back and forth. Apparently, learning years later, there were secret negotiations. So the U.S. agreed they would take their missiles out of Turkey if Russia backed off. So Russia backed off, and eventually the U.S. took their missiles out of Turkey.
Okay, so next question. What do you think of the tactic of massive retaliation, which is like threatening all-out nuclear war to get a country to do what you want? So,
what do I think of the tactic?
Yeah.
It's, there's a word for that, but I can't think of it at the moment. But of course it's, nobody wins a nuclear war. Everybody loses, everybody's dead. There's a certain word. Did you say the word?
Massive retaliation.
Massive retaliation?
It was during
the
Eisenhower.
threat. The threat of it.
Yeah.
Was a kind of a diplomatic thing.
Okay, so do you think this tactic could be used today, or is it still being used today?
I don't think of it being used today. And I don't think it would succeed for anybody's purposes. I don't see how.
So what can you tell me about the Rosenberg's trial?
Oh, well, I remember that. The Rosenbergs. There was a lot of feelings. The Russians got the atomic bomb, and then the hydrogen bomb, and there was a lot of feeling like, well, they couldn't have done it on their own. They somebody must have spied for the U.S. Of course, they can develop it just like the U.S. can develop it, just like any country can develop it. So they were accused of spying. Ethel Rosenberg and Julius Rosenberg. They were sentenced. They were Jewish, of course. The judge was Jewish. There was a lot of feelings among the people who thought the Rosenbergs were innocent, that the judge was just trying to prove that he was a judge and give out the harsh sentence, conviction and sentence. There was a lot of protests, just like for Sacco and Vanzetti, which is another world-famous thing in the Dreyfus situation in France. And nobody in peacetime had ever been executed for any kind of espionage. That was the first of its kind. It was just part of the whole hysteria of the Cold War that would happen like that.
So did you personally support the Rosenbergs?
Yes, I did. I think what later came out is Julius Rosenberg may have done some spying, may have passed something to the Soviets, probably, as much as I understand it, nothing to do with the atomic bomb, and Ethel had nothing to do with it. They were both strong, they were Jewish and strong left-wingers, maybe members of the Communist Party, so they were convenient targets.
So how do you think the outcome of the trial would change if it were done today?
It wouldn't, I don't think it would happen today like it happened then, under the hysteria of the Cold War. And I can't imagine for spying there would be any death sentence today. That's how it would be different.
So you don't think they would have been executed?
No.
Okay.
Under today, if something similar happened today, there would not have been a death penalty for spying in peacetime.
So how did the Red Scare affect you or people you know?
Well, a lot. My background is left-wing, and didn't affect me directly or my immediate family directly, but there were other people who would lose their jobs, or if they had a government job, they were kind of forced out of the government because they had liberal or left-wing leanings. Particularly the labor unions, too. The left wing was forced out of the unions, and unfortunately they were the best organizers in organized labor, so that was a loss to labor. But again, all part of the scare, the Red Scare, the Red Menace.
So, now moving to civil rights and the Vietnam or pre-1950s and American Dream. So, what major events of the civil rights era did you participate in, and what was it like?
There was a lot of activists. I would not consider myself actively participating. I was in the March on Washington, something I wouldn't miss. So I showed up in 1963. But there were freedom fighters in the South, people who actively put their lives at risk. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in total segregation. And I graduated high school in 1956. The Supreme Court saying segregation was not separate but equal and outlawed it was in 1954, but schools didn't change till a number of years after that. So my last year or two in high school, there were a few people of color students that came in my particular high school. But I began to watch everything, particularly around Washington, as everything was segregated. Movie theaters, restaurants, recreation, swimming pools. People of color showed up and protested they were not allowed in, and lots of whites didn't like that. There was violence, there was a lot of fighting, and eventually, little by little, bit by bit, it all changed, where it's kind of unheard of today. Even amazing to think that segregation existed. But I watched all that go through.
So, well, obviously, it's kind of answerable, but do you believe these what you participated in were successful?
Well, I didn't do much. And there are so many people that put themselves at risk. I never participated in it. I might be in a big demonstration where there's a little risk, but there's a lot of people that put themselves at risk and were beaten and some killed. And as a result of their efforts, there's less segregation, less Jim Crow in this country. So it's come back as in the form of mass incarceration.
So how did the war in Vietnam affect everyday life at home?
It didn't affect me. I was not eligible for the draft. But there were a lot of people, a lot of students who fled to Canada who thought the war was wrong and would not partake in it. I did get involved in big demonstrations in Washington at the Washington Monument, downtown Washington. Big mass demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. I think that does overall have an effect. The American people in general were becoming more and more embittered. Everybody knew somebody that was getting killed or injured or that was at risk in Vietnam for no apparent reason other than the politics of administration that was in power, and began to object. It was the will of the American people that caused the U.S. to get out of Vietnam.
Do you know anyone who was involved in Vietnam?
Sure. I know soldiers that were there and back. And when I meet somebody, even today, that was in Vietnam, I say, welcome back. They felt the Vietnam veterans came back, felt like they were shunned. They didn't get a good reception. They certainly weren't treated right by the American government, particularly with Agent Orange, which was denied by the American government for a long time, the ill effects of it.
So do you personally believe the war was justified?
No, the war was a big mistake. It just took over from the French. The French fought to colonialize Vietnam after the Second World War, and the Vietnamese threw them out. And I think the year was 1954. The U.S. was kind of supporting the French at the time. but it was the Vietnamese country, so that's why they prevailed. It was their homeland that they were fighting outsiders coming in and trying to run their country, rule them.
So, what does the American dream mean to you?
The American dream is an expression used mostly in nationalistic causes, like our country is supposedly better than other countries. We have a good degree of freedom in this country, which I think other countries don't have, which is a good thing. The American dream, to some it's reality, to some it's a myth. Like people today can't go to college, it's unaffordable unless you have a lot of money. That's a debatable expression, the American dream.
So, how did the death of Martin Luther King affect you? The people you know.
It didn't affect me. I remember it. Scary moment when it was announced what was going to happen. And yes, there were lots of outpouring from communities of color, people of color, who felt oppressed, and this was one more instance of it. Washington had a lot of rioting, but I was not living in Washington at that time. I was living here in Massachusetts. So no direct effect on me, but I certainly remember it. Remember the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were both becoming more aware of the political economics that go on in society, and that made them a little bit dangerous to people in power at that time.
Okay. Thank you.